Hey, this is Enaa, in with you in the fight back, and today I'm going to talk about Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed. This was Trotsky's last major work, and was completed in 1936. And I want to give you a little bit of the background around when Trotsky actually wrote this work. In 1936, the Soviet Union adopted a new constitution, the supposed most democratic constitution in the world, and it was, on paper. By this point, the Soviet Union had completed its industrialization from the first five-year plan, which had brought tremendous advances, although not so much as the propaganda exclaimed, and largely concentrated in heavy industry. Consumer goods were neglected, to say the least. Collectivization had been completed at the cost of famines embittering the peasantry and a decline in overall agricultural production. At the same time, Stalin is proclaiming to the world that the Soviet Union has entered socialism. We have finally achieved it, comrades. We're there. Well, Trotsky's saying, hold up. Did we really? And this is his indictment. This is Trotsky stripping away the pretense, looking facts squarely in the eye, and saying, has the Soviet Union achieved socialism? Suffice to say, Trotsky believes they certainly have not. And at this point in the international arena, in 1936, we see the triumph of the Popular Front in France and Spain, and the soon-to-be civil war in Spain. Fascism is, of course, on the rise in Germany, in Spain as well. Italy is getting aggressive. And the Soviet Union is largely trying to bring together a grand coalition of the Western powers to oppose fascist aggression, although this kind of goes through various zigs and zags over the next several years. And Trotsky himself is living in exile. He'd just been kicked out of France and is now in Norway, where he's actually under quite a gag order. And by 1936, the terror is beginning in the Soviet Union. The great show trials are starting. Various leaders of the revolution are being condemned and are being shot. Founders who had unimpeachable loyalty to the revolution are being accused of being its greatest traitors. The Revolution Betrayed is Trotsky's indictment of the Soviet Union, of what Stalin or Stalinism has created. Now, if you saw my review on Mao's critique of Soviet economics, you know that I believe Mao had some great insights, but his work was not ultimately a historical critique of Stalin in the Stalinist era. This is. And in its sweep, in its polemical zeal, in its theoretical brilliance, even in its mistakes, it offers us probably one of the great Marxist critiques of a supposed Marxist state. When Trotsky is writing The Revolution Betrayed, rather than actually achieving socialism, the Soviet Union had seen the growth of gross inequalities between highest and lowest wage earners. A bureaucratic stratum had grown and had largely usurped whatever democracy had remained in the Soviets following the Civil War. Furthermore, there was a scramble for both privileges and the necessities of life, with, of course, the privileges going largely to the officer corps, the party machine, managers and administrators. And Trotsky says that socialism cannot exist in such a fashion. He is refuting the claim that the Soviet Russia has actually entered socialism. For Trotsky, although social forms of ownership and the means of production are essential to social ownership, they are certainly not the only factor. Socialism cannot, according to Trotsky, exist in a society of scarcity and poverty. Socialism needs a society of abundance. And without this, the consequences for socialism are quite dire. When Stalin uses that the Soviet Union has entered socialism, he relies on the certain Marxist idea of socialism, or the lower stage, elaborated in the Critique of the Gotha program by Marx, and further elaborated upon by Lenin in The State and the Revolution, that socialism is the stage where you are rewarded each according to your labor, which means that there are wage differentials. Those who work harder will get more than those who don't work as hard. Those who have more children supposedly will make more than those who have no children at all. And he's using these wage differentials, Stalin, to say that this whole ideological pretense to justify the gross wage differentials, the gross inequality that exists in the Soviet Union. When in fact, socialism, and Trotsky would agree here, would initially begin with the birthmarks of capitalism, its great wage differentials, certain inequalities, bourgeois norms of distribution, if you will. But for Trotsky, and I would argue for Marx and Lenin as well, it would be unthinkable that these inequalities would continue to grow as a society progresses towards socialism. In fact, for Trotsky, this strange paradox of a supposed socialist society with growing inequality is in fact signs not of a society that has achieved socialism, but in fact a society that is in a transitional phase between capitalism and socialism. Rather, it is on a two-way street, and it can go back to capitalism or forward to socialism. One thing that characterizes socialism for Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky is the idea of the socialism requires the withering away of the state. And certainly all but the most blind can see that the state under Soviet-style socialism, especially during the Stalin era, certainly did not wither away, but rather grew and grew. We saw this with the coercive organs of the state, the secret police, the military. They grew and grew. Rather, if you read Marx's Civil War in France, the Critique of the Gotha program, or other works, or Lenin's The State and the Revolution, what in fact you see is the idea of the state, that what they urged was, yes, a dictatorship of the proletariat. I do not want to get into a long discussion now on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Suffice to say, the dictatorship of the proletariat can, in the eyes of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky, can be equated with workers' democracy, rule of the working class. There's a whole other issue about the dictatorship of the proletariat, but I'm not going to get into that now. And the example that Marx and Engels used for the dictatorship of the proletariat, at least in their lifetime, was the Paris Commune, an example of direct democracy by the working class that unfortunately only lasted about 70 days in Paris. And Lenin, of course, took this up, and it's elaborated upon in The State and the Revolution. And rather, the Paris Commune, the standing army was abolished. Its bureaucracy was severely limited. Public officials were subject to direct voting and recall by the population. It really was a society where inequality was being curbed by the producers themselves. In fact, members of the Paris Commune couldn't make more than that of a skilled worker. And this was a state, the Paris Commune, that was rapidly moving in a semi-state direction. Again, instead of a parliament separated from the population, a parliament that's very close, a working parliament close to the population itself. And the state was moving from the administration of the people to administration of things. In a sense, the standing army, which administers people, is replaced by a militia made up of the population itself. And in the Soviet Union, this is not the case. As I just said, the state's role is growing. The vast bureaucracy created by the 5-year plans, collectivization, and the continued military buildup. And part of the justification that Stalin would use for the growth of the state is the capitalist encirclement, which was certainly a real threat, as would become very clear in 1941 when the Soviet Union found itself at war with Nazi Germany. Yet the state is not just there to protect against capitalist encirclement. The state's coercive arms, its secret police, its army, is also needed to protect the bureaucracy, the Stalinist leadership, against workers and peasants who are embittered and justifiably angry at the privileges that the bureaucracy is usurping. And Trotsky, in making this critique of the Soviet state, the Soviet Union, and in the Soviet Union's pretense to socialism, is in a way that disavowing Marxism from the crimes of the Soviet Union. Now you can decide for yourself whether you accept that or not. I myself do. One of the core strengths of the revolution betrayed its analysis of the Soviet bureaucracy, or Stalinism. And Stalinism for Trotsky is the defense of privilege by the rulers. They protect their own interests against workers in the Soviet Union. And this interest, any ruling class wants a certain amount of stability in the protection of their interests, of their property, of their wealth. And to do this at the same time that the Soviet Union doesn't really want revolutionary experiments at home, they don't want them abroad. And Trotsky has many chapters devoted to Soviet foreign policy and how Stalin was doing pretty much all he could to prevent revolutionary breakthroughs in Germany, in Spain, in China, and elsewhere. And at the same time this is happening, the bureaucracy is largely forming conservative ideas in art, science, the military, czarist ranks were restored, the family, education, all laid out there for you to read. And the bureaucracy, again, is made up of managers, civil servants, party officials, the military caste, and Trotsky estimates about 12 to 15% of the population. Now, this idea, I believe most historians would tell you certainly yes, there was a vast privileged stratum in the Soviet Union. Whether we call it a class or bureaucracy or whatnot is not important here. There certainly was a privileged elite. What Trotsky is asking is the bureaucracy necessary, or rather, is it inevitable, the growth of bureaucracy under socialism? Because if you accept the Soviet Union as socialist, then certainly there was a malignant growth of the bureaucratic machine in the Soviet Union. And Trotsky thinks no, this was not inevitable. The growth of bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was caused by the vast want, poverty, and isolation the country suffered. Yet no revolution, even in the most advanced capitalist country, the United States, Britain, Germany, wherever, can abolish inequality right away. There would be some wage differentials, that idea of bourgeois distribution I mentioned earlier, to each according to his labor as opposed to each according to his need, which would be communist distribution. The revolutionary state has to provide for skilled workers, technicians, administrators to help develop the economy so that they can create this society of abundance so each can receive according to his need. If they need to pay them differently, they have to pay them more than a regular worker. At the same time, in order to achieve socialist and communist goals, a revolutionary state has to do whatever they can to abolish wage differentials. Yet you need that social wealth. It's quite a contradiction, to be sure. And Trotsky hopes or believes that with the increase of social wealth, so everyone can get according to their need, and a universal and higher education, which would increase the culture of the population, that this would reduce not only the wage differentials, but the gap between mental and manual labor that is a hallmark under capitalism. Well, a socialist state, again, has to defend and work towards socialist goals. Again, this should be a state in the process of withering away. And there's social ownership of the means of production by the working class. But there's also wage differentials that are a bourgeois method. You have the socialist and the bourgeois on the one hand, or on either hand. And in the Soviet Union, according to Trotsky, the socialist element is declining. We see this bureaucratic stratum. And then on the other hand, we see these wage differentials, these gross inequalities. And the bourgeois element is gaining the ascendancy. And Trotsky likens the bureaucracy, this growth, to a policeman who keeps order in a crowd amid a shortage of goods. If the crowd is pretty large, you need to start having policemen there, and you need to start providing for them, keeping files, and this leads to the growth of a bureaucracy. Now, conceivably, if there's no shortage, you don't need policemen. I'd argue you don't need policemen at all, but whatever. Now, does the bureaucracy destroy socialism? Is it a new social class? Now, there's a lot of objections to this theory of Trotsky's. Trotsky says the bureaucracy is not a new class. It has managerial functions, but it has no social. It has no social homogeneity. It acts like it owns the state and industry, but technically it doesn't. The bureaucrats cannot appropriate and inherit the means of production. They cannot pass on to their children. They cannot pass on factory aid to their son or daughter. Their ownership is bound up with state ownership of production. They have to defend that ownership. And in a sense, that state ownership, again, which is a prerequisite for socialism, or the social ownership, I should say, is a prerequisite for socialism. And in protecting that social ownership, that makes them progressive. Yet this is unstable, according to Trotsky. Either the bourgeois or the bureaucrats will prevail, or socialism prevail. Now, if the bureaucrats prevail, they will actually want to become a full-on capitalist class. They want to expropriate state and industry, becoming regular private capitalists that we are so enamored of right here in the United States. And become a full capitalist class. And Stalin, at the same time, he encourages the bureaucrats, their acquisition, their consumption habits, the fact that they have to shop at special stores that have goods not available to people. He's helping them. He's helping to foster them. Yet, at the same time, these bureaucrats are threatening the conquests of the revolution, and Stalin has purges of them, the trials and all this, and the bureaucracy is in a constant state of flux, and it's obviously quite hard for a bureaucracy in a state of flux to form itself into a homogeneous social class. Yet the flux won't last forever. Eventually, so it's going to come down one way. Capitalism or socialism. You can't have an unstable situation forever. Now, I talked about what would happen if the bureaucrats went out, a restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Trotsky obviously doesn't want this to happen. He wants another method. He's calling for a political revolution in the Soviet Union. He believes that the era of peaceful reform has passed, and certainly by this point in the 30s, dissent is widely suppressed in the Soviet Union. And the workers need to overthrow this bureaucracy. And Trotsky, like many communists, had believed that a worker state emerging from a revolution would be democratic. It would be like the Paris Commune, in a sense. It would have direct democracy. But like bourgeois revolutions, the state that emerges isn't necessarily democratic. We've seen bourgeois revolutions that emerge with democratic states, republican states, constitutional monarchies, straight-on monarchies, what have you. And there's following this. There's a brief section of what actually the reforms Trotsky was calling for, and I'll have them read out there because I think that you should see that Trotsky is calling for a return to the ideals and the early principles of the revolution. And many of these ideas would be later taken up by later Soviet reformers in various guises and in various ways. And there was reform after. Now, Trotsky's belief that there would be hopefully a political revolution of the working class to restore Soviet democracy did not come to pass. Yet, it was quite some time before capitalist restoration full-on happened in the Soviet Union. And there was reform of the worst abuses of the Stalinist system under Khrushchev. There was a kind of stabilization in the Brezhnev era, but we didn't really see full-on restoration kick in until Gorbachev. But that's Trotsky again is calling for a political revolution in the Soviet Union.
It is not a question of substituting one ruling clique for another, but of changing the very methods of administering the economy and guiding the culture of the country. Bureaucratic autocracy must give place to Soviet democracy. A restoration of the right of criticism and a genuine freedom of elections are necessary conditions for the further development of the country. This assumes a revival of freedom of Soviet parties, beginning with the party of Bolsheviks, and a resurrection of the trade unions. The bringing of democracy into industry means a radical revision of plans in the interests of the toilers. Free discussion of economic problems will decrease the overhead expense of bureaucratic mistakes and zigzags. Expensive playthings, palaces of the Soviets, new theaters, show-off subways will be crowded out in favor of workers' dwellings. Bourgeois norms of distribution will be confined within the limits of strict necessity, and in step with the growth of social wealth will give way to socialist equality. Ranks will be immediately abolished. The tinsel of decorations will go into the melting pot. The youth will receive the opportunity to breathe freely, criticize, make mistakes, and grow up. Science and art will be freed of their chains. And finally, foreign policy will return to the traditions of revolutionary internationalism.
So, where did this Stalinist bureaucracy come from? What happened? How did the Soviet Union go from the great ideals and the democracy that we saw in 1917 to 20 years later, a repressive, tyrannical regime with growing inequalities? The Thermidor, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a counter-revolution or almost a reaction within a revolution. And the term originates from the French Revolution during its most radical phase, when the Jacobins under Maximilien Robespierre were overthrown in 1793. And a lot of the radical ideas were pushed back in the French Revolution, and a rather conservative phase set in that eventually, within about 6 years, led to the rise of Napoleon. And Trotsky traces this to a lot of the devastation from the Civil War, the decline in Soviet power, Soviets, i.e., council democracy, and the demobilization of the army, the declassing of the working class, its destruction largely in the Civil War, the want, the poverty, the isolation. And he sees the Thermidor as originating from, say, 1923. Now, I'm going to say I share this view of Trotsky's, but there's a lot of debate on this when counter-revolution happened in the Soviet Union. Maoists will trace it differently. For instance, it could be traced to 56 with Khrushchev. Charles Bettelheim has a slightly different analysis. And despite my problems with various methods of these, ways of looking at it, I believe you should also check out these views as well, because they're quite important, and in many cases, they really do contribute to this debate. But anyway, 1923 is the defeat of the opposition, the left opposition of Trotsky's, in its opening salvo with Stalin, and at the same time as the defeat, unfortunately, of the 1923 German Revolution that could have spared us all Hitler and had a revolution in an advanced capitalist country. And Stalin's regime has a Bonapartist character. At the same time, it's leading to a capitalist restoration because of its growth of the bourgeois differentials we spoke about, the curtailment of Soviet powers trying to play off the working class against the bureaucracy. Stalin is pushing a lot of anti-egalitarian ideas, and there's a lot of ebbing of revolutionary energy throughout the 1920s. In a certain way and form, these would be re-energized with the industrialization and collectivization, but this was more a revolution from above, not below. And Stalin's giving concessions to bureaucrats, yet he's fighting them at the same time. Again, it's kind of Bonapartist in that sense. He's not breaking the system, yet the system is unstable. And Stalin is not, in foreign policy, again, he's not relying on revolutionary internationalism, but on traditional diplomacy. At the time Trotsky's writing, 1936, it's pretty clear that Europe is heading for war, and of course this does happen. There have been defeats of revolutionaries abroad. Germany, Austria. The French Popular Front is not going to lead to revolution. The Spanish Civil War, which was beginning just as his book was finished, leads to the dictatorship of Francoist fascism. And of course China and the United Kingdom earlier. And Stalin again he's more relying on a traditional army, not so much the workers and peasants army that we had seen in the initial days of the revolution. And he thinks an alliance with imperialism can help, or Western imperialism, United Kingdom, France, can help the Soviet Union defeat fascism. Now Trotsky believes that the prospects of the Soviet Union surviving the coming war is not very good. And he believes that in a defeat of the Soviet Union in the war, it will lead to a restoration of capitalism. Yet at the same time, he hopes that if the workers rise up in Europe, they can create revolutionary states which would have almost a rebound effect on the Soviet Union, re-energize the revolution there, and kind of cast off the Stalinist bureaucrats. But either way, he really doesn't think Stalinism is going to survive World War II. In conclusion, this is probably one of Trotsky's most important works. This is, whenever someone tells you that Marxists, we can't explain the Soviet Union, we can't explain what happened, we can, we have. And furthermore, this work has really laid a lot of the, it was really the pioneer in setting Marx's critiques of the Soviet Union. It's not the first, obviously, there have been others before and there have been others after. But Trotsky's work is one of the trailblazers in Marxist critiques of the Soviet Union. And it's showing not all us Marxists really are Stalin lovers. But there's a lot of criticism of it. Tony Cliff takes exception to the idea that the bureaucracy is just a caste, not class. He believes that there was state capitalism. And other Trotskyists have followed him in this. This is the whole theory of bureaucratic collectivism. The Maoists have their own ideas of state capitalism. And a lot of Trotsky's prognoses ended up being wrong. The Soviet Union did survive World War II. Stalinism actually lasted until, I would argue until 1953, when it was definitely replaced with a much milder system. But this work, in its insights into its understanding and into its use of the Marxist dialectic, is really one of the seminal works, if I may say, in the Marxist canon. And I really hope that you pick it up. Don't take my word for it. Take Trotsky's. This is Enaa in with the Fight.